Integrating quotes, MLA formatting. Integrating quotations into an essay. A quotation should never stand alone as a complete sentence, or worse yet, as an incomplete sentence. Think of the quote as a helium balloon. When a helium balloon is let go, it flies away. If a quote is not held down by a sentence, it will disconnect from the thought and flow of the paragraph. There are 4 commonly used ways to integrate quotations. Integration 1. Introduce the quotation with a complete sentence and a colon. Example: in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau directly states his purpose for going into the woods. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what I had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Another example: Thoreau's philosophy might be summed up best by his repeated request for people to ignore the insignificant details of life. Our life is frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases he may add his 10 toes and lump the rest. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. As you can see in both of these quotes, the sentence before the quote is actually a complete sentence on its own. Integration 1 continued. Another example: Thoreau ends his essay with a metaphor. Time is but the stream I go fishing in. This method is an easy rule to remember. If a complete sentence is used to introduce the quotation, a colon is needed after the sentence. Be careful not to confuse the colon with a semicolon. Using a comma in this situation will most likely create a comma splice, one of the serious sentence boundary errors. Integration 2. Use an introductory or explanatory phrase, but not a complete sentence, separated from the quotation with a comma. In Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau directly states his purpose for going into the woods when he says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Another example: Thoreau suggests the consequences of a person making themselves a slave to progress when he says, we do not ride on a railroad, it rides upon us. As you can see, both of these sentences are not complete, which is why it states he says and is only a comma. A third example: Thoreau asks, why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? One more. According to Thoreau, we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. A comma should be used to separate your own words from the quotation when your introductory or explanatory phrase ends with a verb such as says, said, thinks, believes, pondered, recalls, questions, and asked, and many more. You should also use a comma when you introduce a quotation with such a phrase as according to Thoreau. Integration 3. Make the quotation part of your own sentence without any punctuation between your own words and the words you are quoting, of course, other than quotation marks. Thoreau directly states his purpose for going into the woods when he says that I went into the woods because I wished to live deliberately. As you can see, there are ellipses used because the rest of the quotation is not there. Another example: Thoreau suggests the consequences of making ourselves slaves to progress when he says that we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. Hopefully you see that in both of these sentences, it says that before the actual quote. Integration 3. Continue. Thoreau argues that shams and delusions are esteemed for soundest truths, while reality is fabulous. Another example: according to Thoreau, people are too often thrown off by the tracks by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls off the rails. Notice that the word that is used in 3 of the examples in these instances. That replaces the comma, which would be necessary without that in the sentence. You can choose which option works best for you. When you begin a sentence with a phrase such as Thoreau says, you either can add a comma after says, Thoreau says, comma, then the quotation, or you can add the word that with no comma. Thoreau says that, and then the quotation. Integration 4. Use short quotations, only a few words, as part of your own sentence. Example, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states that his retreat to the woods around Walden Pond was motivated by his desire to live deliberately and to face only the essential facts of life. As you can see, only parts of what he said were put into your own sentence, and the citation is at the end of the sentence. Another example, Thoreau argues that people blindly accept shams and delusions as the soundest truths, while regarding reality as fabulous. Integration 4 continued. Example, although Thoreau drinks at the stream of time, he can detect how shallow it is. As you can see, the S is in brackets, which means the original quote had drink, not drinks. To make the sentence make sense, the S had to be added. When quotations are integrated in this way, no special punctuation is needed. Instead, the sentence should be punctuated just as it would if all the words were your own. No punctuation is needed in the sentences above because the sentences do not follow the pattern explained under number 1 and 2 above. There is not a complete sentence in front of the quotations, and a word such as says, said, or asks does not appear directly in front of the quoted words. Quotation punctuation. There are only 2 punctuation marks that are used to introduce quotations, the comma and the colon. Note that the semicolon is not used to introduce quotations. 2 basic rules that will help you use the correct punctuation when a sentence is both a quotation and a parenthetical citation. The end quotation mark should be placed immediately after the last word of the quotation, and the period should be placed immediately after the citation. This sentence shows these marks placed correctly. Whereas American myth states that Columbus alone thought the world was round, in actuality, few people on both sides of the Atlantic believed in 1492 that the world was flat. Since a period ends this quotation, the period is only placed after the citation. Explanation on other punctuation will come further. Punctuation without immediate citation. If you're going to have a quote in the middle of a sentence, you are not going to cite it until the end of that sentence. In turn, when you are not citing a source immediately after a quotation, the punctuation, usually a comma or a period, is placed inside the quotation mark, like this. It does not go outside, like this. Example, when history textbooks portray famous figures as pious, perfect creatures without conflicts, pain, credibility, or human interest, they make those figures seem less human and thus less interesting. Special cases, that or comma. If you are using the word that to introduce a quotation, do not also use a comma. These 2 sentences show the 2 options. James Loewen states that socialism is repugnant to most Americans. James Loewen states socialism is repugnant to most Americans. When the quotation ends with ellipses, you must also have an end period. The ellipses marks do not end the sentence. Many agrarian Native American tribes moved west because intensified warfare and the slave trade rendered stable settlements no longer safe. In this sentence, there are actually 2 things to look at. One is the I is in brackets. This means that with the original quote, it was capitalized. However, you do not capitalize anything in the middle of a sentence. Thus, the I is in brackets. As you can tell, it ends in ellipses, and there is a citation afterwards, which is where the period ends up. Question marks or exclamations. When the quote ends with a question mark or an exclamation point, include it inside the quotation marks. Those punctuation marks add meaning to the sentence. Then include the citation and a period at the end of the sentence. James Mullins asks, why should children believe what they learn in American history if their textbooks are full of distortions and lies? Question mark, then the citation and the period. If the quotation you are using includes a quoted word or phrase, use single quotation marks around the quotation within the quotation. When asked about Helen Keller's adult life, many students ventured that Keller became a public figure or humanitarian, perhaps on the behalf of the blind or deaf. As you can see, public figure and humanitarian are in single quotes. The reason why is the source that this came from actually had public figure or humanitarian in actual quotes. Embedded quotes. Single quotation marks are also used when dialogue appears within a larger quote. Jake describes his method for getting rid of unwanted friends. Once you had a drink, all you had to say was, well, I've got to get back and get off some cables. And it was done. As you can see in this quote, whatever was spoken is actually in single quotation marks. Notice how the double quotation marks enclose the entire quote, while the single quotation marks enclose the dialogue within. Thus, the rule is doubles on the outside, singles on the inside. If the entire quotation is wholly dialogue, only double quotation marks are necessary.